We are so pleased to have Anthony Flaccavento back to lead a second webinar, especially with such important new information for all of our efforts to scale up good food. Anthony Flaccavento is an organic farmer near Abington, Virginia, in the heart of Appalachian, Virginia. He's been working on community environmental and economic development in Central Appalachia for the past 25 years. In 1995, he founded Appalachian Sustainable Development, which has become a regional and national leader in sustainable economic development. Anthony left ASD in December 2009 to found Scale, Inc., a private consulting business dedicated to catalyzing and supporting ecologically healthy regional economies and food systems. He has written and spoken about sustainable development, ecology and economics, food systems, and Appalachian issues extensively and continues to do so today. Anthony has received a number of awards and honors for his work in recent years, including the Ford Foundation Leadership for a Changing World Award, the Arthur Smith Environmental Stewardship Award, and selection by Blue Ridge Magazine in 2009 as one of Central Appalachia's most important agents for positive change. He was a Kellogg National Food and Society Policy Fellow during 2007 and 2008. Anthony has a BS degree in Agriculture and Environmental Sciences from the University of Kentucky and a master's degree in Economic and Social Development from the University of Pittsburgh. He is married with 3 children. Anthony?
Greetings to all. Thank you for being part of this webinar. Jeff, thank you for that great introduction. I want to go ahead and start by giving credit to some of the folks who were key behind this undertaking, the webinar, and the work that went into the information you're about to hear. First of all, the Ford Foundation's Institute of International Education provided funding for the research, the development of the survey, and the gathering and analysis of the survey results, which will constitute the largest part of this gathering. And of course, today we're delighted that really 3 organizations are co-hosting this: Appalachian Sustainable Development with Director Denise Barrett, the Wallace Center, represented by Jeff. Many of you know John Fisk, the head of the Wallace Center's National Good Food Network, and the Central Appalachian Network. Jeff, I need you to move a slide. So very quickly, Jeff is going to talk at more length about the Good Food Network, but I think many of you are already aware of the work that it has been doing for the last couple of years at the national level to basically try to support and link together some very innovative value chain good food work around the country. Appalachian Sustainable Development has a broad mission around building a sustainable economy in the region. Within that, working on a market-based approach to creating these ecologically sound enterprises and at the same time promoting healthy communities, healthy food systems. And the Central Appalachian Network is a group of groups, 7 nonprofits that have been collaborating for about 15 years now, a little bit more, and working again to really try to transform the Appalachian economy from one that's been based more on extraction and low-value enterprises, often harming the community or the environment, to one that's an exemplar of sustainable development, so a fairly ambitious undertaking there. Jeff, slide. So value chains. Value chains are a rather new concept that bring together the idea that whenever we have a product, it begins, in the case of food products, with farms and farmers, the land that they tend. And that at some point, in order to get those farm products to people who eat, there has to be some sort of infrastructure, some sort of system to bring it all together. This picture of the Appalachian Harvest Facility is one example of a place where farm products are aggregated and then ultimately moved to market. And the markets can be of all sizes and all types, but there is a chain of interactions that take place there. And this happens in every single segment of the food industry, not just with produce, but of course the same thing with livestock, beginning with the animals on the land, the pasture and the ranches, moving through to the often elusive food processing facilities, the slaughterhouses, which many of our communities lack, and that are absolutely essential to get, whether it's beef or pork or lamb or poultry, to the market. And then again, finally, to the wide range of venues, be they restaurants, institutional buyers, or retail that are going to use that product. Simply put, a supply chain, you can think of, this is somewhat of a simplification to be sure, but a supply chain really has three central components: the supply itself of the product, in this case food, some form of what we've come to call PAD, processing, aggregation, and distribution, and a given supply chain, I should say, may or may not have all three of those things. There may not be a processing element. There may not be much of a distribution element if the supply chain is very, very local, but some form or another of those three things. And then lastly, of course, the markets. Now again, this is a simplification because you could tease out every one of those three. You could look at supply and say, well, it isn't just the farmers, it's the farm co-ops in southern states that provide feed, that provide straw, that provide seeds. It's local compost makers or manufacturers of farm equipment and farm implements, etc. But those are the three kind of core elements of a supply chain. Now a value chain, taking that same approach of those three central components, is essentially a supply chain with deliberately stated values that you are trying to infuse in there. So those values in a typical value chain might include things like reducing your carbon footprint, and that would lead you towards aiming towards local and regional markets instead of national and international markets. A value certainly that's common in value chains would be how the land is managed. Is it organic? Is it sustainable? Grass-based? Are we avoiding draining wetlands, etc.? And then another value that, again, is typical in value chains would be that the processing, aggregation, and distribution be locally owned or at least locally managed and locally accessible so that you have the possibility of building local capacity, of increasing local wealth, that instead of 70 or 80 or 85% of the final value of the food dollar taking place outside the region, the vast, vast majority stays within the region where the product is being raised or grown. So a value chain is basically a supply chain with stated values that you're trying to accomplish at each stage. And let me say also that as we're going to see later a brief report that was done by Rich Pirog and Steve Stevenson, as they also make clear, it isn't just that each element does a better job at respecting human beings and respecting the environment, but it's also the transparency of all that, that in a truly well-functioning value chain, and this is asking a lot, but that there's transparency so that you can see not only how things are being managed and who's doing what sort of practices, but you can see who's getting what benefit so that the benefits are relatively proportionally or equally divided. You have farmers and farm workers getting their fair share. You have people at the PAD, aggregation and distribution, being able to receive a relatively fair wage, etc., so that you distribute those benefits in that fashion. So the heart of this undertaking was this small survey that was done by Appalachian Sustainable Development with support, financial support from the Ford IIE. And it was a very targeted, let me say this up front, we did not attempt to do a broad national survey of every single group that has an interest in health, food systems, sustainable agriculture. Rather, we picked using, I should say, the CAN list of folks that they're familiar with in the Central Appalachian region, of course, Appalachian Sustainable Development's own list, the Wallace Center Good Food Network's list, and we built a small base. It was about 75 groups that are involved in one way or another with this type of value chain work, and those are that was the universe of people who received the survey. We did the survey, sent it a couple of times, did a modest amount of phone call follow-up to try to elicit additional responses, and in the final analysis received 21 responses of the 75. There were 7 questions that comprised this. I won't read all of them, but those are the 7 questions. The first one basically got at who, what, where and the second one getting into a little bit more specifically how people participated in the value chain. And then the balance of the questions got into the issue of what are you finding are your challenges, what are you finding works, and what do you think what are your key needs to move this question of building supply forward more rapidly, more effectively. A quick analysis of the survey responses themselves, just in terms of who responded. First of all, the location of the respondents was about 2/3 in the Appalachian region, the central Appalachian region, and about 1/3 outside, with some notable value chain participants in places like Missouri, Massachusetts, New York, and other places. Although this was actually not the same group, 2/3 and 1/3, but the same breakdown was we found in terms of people involved in the value chain work, how directly or indirectly were they involved. And that was, again, about 2/3 relatively directly involved. Now, this would mean that at some point in that value chain that we looked at earlier, the supply, the processing, aggregation, and distribution, or the marketing, this business or group identified itself as being directly involved in some element. And then 1/3 were more indirectly, and those would have been folks doing technical support, education, advocacy, those types of things. Looking at the product mix, the overwhelming majority were involved in produce, about half in meat, egg, and dairy, one or another, or all of those. And a little less than 20% were focused primarily on value-added foods, which is to say on processed foods. 43%, not quite half, had multiple products within the value chain that they were involved with. And then one group, which in this small survey is 4%, was uniquely involved in grains, in the full range of activities in the supply chain around grains. The emphasis on organic or sustainably produced foods we saw in 57%, so that's, again, a little more than half, put that as a focus. Virtually everybody said that was kind of a goal or something that some of their producers did, but 57% said that was a focus. The services provided were a mix, and in this case, I will say, if you look at that chart, you'll see that 42% stated they were involved directly in marketing, sales, or merchandising, and another 42% said they were involved in processing, aggregation, and distribution. And in this case, it was the same 42%. So what we found, at least in this limited survey, was that when people were involved in processing, aggregation, distribution, or PAD, they also tended very strongly to be involved in merchandising and sales of products. The other categories were a little bit more dispersed. Those were the dominant ones in terms of what kind of involvement these different groups had in the sample, but there was more indirect marketing assistance. Those would be like buy local campaigns and things of that sort. Some of the value-added groups were involved in product testing and development, a little bit of consumer outreach, and then the other consistent thing, about 20% was education and training for producers, whether they were farmers or food product entrepreneurs. The experience level ranged from groups that had entered into value chain work for the first time in 2009 to groups that had been at it for over a decade. Probably the vast majority of the groups have been involved in the healthy food, sustainable ag realm for quite a few years, but value chain work, and I think this speaks to some of the difficulty and the high risk of being involved with value chain work, was newer for most folks. So the next several slides get to the heart of the responses that we found in the value chain work. We did not ask this question about the main challenges or obstacles faced in building supply, nor did we ask the next two questions about effective responses in terms of market, infrastructure, production, or policy. That was not part of the question. It was simply stated. But the responses I organized in this way because they were fairly consistently coming out in those groups. So in terms of the main challenges and obstacles that people face, overwhelmingly, the most commonly cited set of challenges or obstacles had to do with markets, 70%, so almost 3/4. And this is an interesting point, I think, because, first of all, this was a survey focused on how do you build supply, how do you accelerate the development of supply. At the same time, many groups involved with value chain work, with organic and sustainable foods and local food economy movement over the last few years, and I put myself in this group, you'll hear a lot of us say that there's much more demand than supply, that the markets are very strong and that the real issue is supply. And I think that's very true. But in spite of that, most of the groups still cited specific and fairly significant challenges and problems with the market that they felt were constraining or making the development of supply more difficult. So you have a big market for local foods, organic foods, healthy foods, but you still have market challenges. I think that's one important takeaway from this, more than any other category of response that was there. Within that, we'll talk more detail about each of these, but the biggest of the market challenges, by far the biggest, was the question of pricing. Infrastructure was the second most commonly cited challenge or problem. Infrastructure was in a little more than half of the cases. And interestingly, it seemed to break out that basically the groups, the respondents that themselves did not manage or own and operate infrastructure, virtually all cited infrastructure as a substantial challenge or obstacle. So that's perhaps not surprising. Those that had infrastructure cited it as a key asset and tool, and those did not said that's what we need is infrastructure. So that lack of infrastructure or that inadequate access to infrastructure covered a wide range from distribution to processing to aggregation, and in some cases all of the above. Production was close behind infrastructure as a challenge, and here folks were focused primarily on the actual farm practices, although in some cases this production also includes food entrepreneurs. So most of this relates to farmers, but some to other people a step up in the value chain. And then the responses you can see there covered pretty much what one would expect. Part of the production challenges were a lack of sufficient training, what one might call particularly farmer-friendly training, to get the word out, to get it out effectively. Definitely some problems with funds. Most of what the good food value chain movement involves is a transition of some sort for most farmers, not all but many. And to make that transition usually involves some sort of capitalization, some sort of expense. In a few cases, but this was much more limited, there was issues of cost or access to land. And then there was a sort of embedded in some of the responses the idea about general production challenges and particularly how do you make money at farming, to put it succinctly. And then in terms of public policy, a little more than 1/4 of the respondents mentioned policy as a significant challenge or obstacle. Let me again make note here that the nature of the pool of people we invited to respond to this survey probably skewed this result. We simply didn't invite policy-oriented groups. We invited groups that we classified as practitioners, essentially. Practitioners or very strongly and closely associated with practitioners. So the universe of respondents was more on-the-ground enterprises and NGOs involved in an entrepreneurial way. So it's, again, probably a little bit of a bias against policy. Nonetheless, policy came up from a little more than 1/4, and the biggest part of policy was this idea around regulatory issues, whether it was GAP, particularly it was big for livestock and dairy folks, some of the public policy hurdles at both state and federal levels. The next, after dealing with the question of problems and challenges, we here move to, okay, so what works? What are the tools, the practices, the incentives that, in your experience, have helped increase supply? And again, I organize them by those tools and practices and incentives that relate to the market, that relate to infrastructure, and the other two categories. Within the market, the single most effective thing was the idea of securing a strong and predictable demand from buyers. And several respondents went to some length to talk about how important not just, again, a large demand is, but a predictable demand, that is to say, a reliable market partner or set of market partners. And right on its heels, again, this question of securing good and stable prices. In many responses, those two were inseparable. They were part of the same sentence, even, to say what works and what we most need is this predictable demand that pays well, and where the price is going to be pretty reliable. It's not going to have highs and lows to any great degree. The infrastructure tools and incentives, just generally speaking, people refer to having infrastructure or having access to infrastructure as being quite critical. Pretty evenly divided between aggregation and distribution, again with an emphasis on systems of aggregation and distribution that are relatively easy for farmers to participate in. That's a key. That has a lot of implications. That has to do with how much can you localize infrastructure, which is pretty expensive to build and even more expensive to operate. But the part of it being accessible to farmers and working for farmers does have to do with it being pretty dispersed and decentralized. It has to do with the steps farmers have to take to be able to participate in using that infrastructure. So, but that was quite an important one, and along with that, the idea that it was an effective practice to actually get involved with building the value chains, including the producer networks that help facilitate this participation. In terms of production practices, about a third of folks cited specific tools, and most of them broke down, as you see, either in providing or facilitating access to good quality workshops. Again, I like to use the term farmer-friendly training here, that farmers who have varying levels of education can participate in and still get good solid research and good solid information. And then the other one, not too much behind it in terms of the number of responses, was this cost sharing and financial support. And in terms of public policy, although again a relatively small number of people cited this as an effective tool, it was quite a critical tool for a few of the respondents. The two main elements of public policy people felt worked to build a supply included basically procurement is the first category. That is, to say incentives to induce institutions, universities, state agencies, and others to buy local, buy regional. And the second is, again, money, getting money to the farm in some form or fashion, cost sharing, et cetera. The final question related to, we understand what the problems and challenges are. We have a sense of what the effective tools that you've experienced. What do you think the additional elements or resources are that are needed to build supply? And within the category of market, where again more than a majority responded with different needs and resources they cited, an interesting one emerged here that was a little bit different, and it was stated, of course, in a lot of different ways, but very consistently, and that was just that we need better consumer understanding of what this really means, the true costs and the benefits. A lot of people expressed that even though there was a seemingly large demand, when you got down to things like paying a little bit more for it, being willing to perhaps deal with things like seasonality or some degree of inconsistency that typically goes along with value chain work, particularly in the early years, that's when you start losing that market share. And so a lot of even the most practical groups who were not doing a great deal of consumer education seem to cite this as a critical concern. How do we still, everybody's into local foods now, everybody wants to eat healthy, but how do we really bring the public along to understand what this entails? A different one, of course, was in addition to trying to get those who can afford to pay a little more, was how do we make these good, healthy foods affordable and available to lower-income people was the other main tool within that. I'm going to come back at the end to look at that last one. It was a point made by just a couple of groups, but a pretty critical one that I'm going to talk about, which is the issue of leverage. How do you gain leverage? Because consistently people seem to feel that they don't have much. Infrastructure, pretty close to the earlier responses. Basically more of it, more accessible, more efficient, and more effective. That's, again, the PAD, processing, aggregation, and distribution. And although only one group stated this, I think probably my guess is that virtually all the groups would agree that if we can make these infrastructure systems work, we want to see them as much as possible in the private sector, not just run by nonprofits. Production, again, turned on better quality and more readily available training, technical assistance, mentorship for farmers, particularly when some talked about bringing newer and younger farmers in. There was a lot of discussion of mentorship. And in that same vein, a couple of groups recommended a training of trainers, that they felt that would really be helpful to them, that instead of just being dependent, whether it's on the land grant or extension or an NGO that does good training, they wanted to see their own folks, farmers, and local people trained to be able to carry that forward. And in public policy, we have, again, this repeat of the desire to get more institutions and more public sector concerns involved by local preferences, basically. The side of that was also came up in a couple of cases, which is to eliminate public policy that is biased against small farmers, that hurts small farmers. So in an overall sense, the two most common challenges, going back to the first substantive question that occurred, were low and unpredictable prices for products, and you could sort of state that also as an unpredictable market. So it was both pricing and markets, and inadequate infrastructure for getting products from farm to market. Within the first of those two, the pricing challenges, a few elements teased out a little bit. First is the question of what is an adequate price, because prices are relative. These prices, however a farmer perceives them, have a lot to do with whether farmers come on board in the first place. A big issue, I know all of you who are involved in this know that one of the first questions you often get from farmers is, well, if I do this, how much can I make? And then that quickly leads to a discussion of what will I produce and what does it sell for? By the same token, farmers who try it want to see good prices along with their own efficient production, but you have an issue if you aren't able to sustain good prices, that you also lose a lot of growers. So the question of getting farmers involved and keeping farmers involved and other producers in the chain very strongly influenced by the prices you are able to secure for them. And also keep in mind that relatively low prices, of course, are hard on the NGO or the business, the private business, that is in the middle of the value chain, because for the most part, whether it's a private model or an NGO model, a lot of the income for operating these value chains comes from some sort of a fee or some sort of a percentage, and that means operating at scale, and that means operating efficiently, but it also means that the lower the price, the less the aggregator and distributor is going to be able to take per pallet, per truck, per ton. And so pricing is not only critical to the growers, but it's really quite critical to the buyers, the aggregators as well. So a good price, of course, is relative. Some of the groups work primarily with farmers market type growers. Others work more with wholesale growers. And those two types of growers see those prices differently. I think it's fair to say that there is, generally speaking, an inverse relationship between volume and pricing. So bigger buyers want stuff cheaper, what they would call competitive pricing. Smaller buyers tend to give better prices, but then it takes more of those small buyers buying more diverse products. And so that leads us to the conclusion that just some value chains are better suited to the real small growers than others. And I want to kind of wind things up with a few examples of some of these different experiences. Grasshoppers Distribution, a relatively new group in Louisville, Kentucky, manages a full value chain from production to distribution and marketing. However, their value chain is almost entirely CSA based. In 2009, they had a little more than 100 farmers selling to a little more than 400 members. In this coming year, their goal is to get up to 800 members, 800 buyers, that is. Basically, it's individuals. It's a CSA. There is a small wholesale component that they're trying to develop, including hospitals and schools. But what they're finding, I spoke to the director of Grasshopper, is a common challenge, that as they grow this, they're finding that they need the farmers to do a little more. They need to bring it to them in a better state. They have been picking up from farmers, and they're probably going to have to eliminate that and have farmers bring it to a central distribution. And then this question, again, of finding the right price point that's good enough for the producers to get them involved and keep them involved in making some money, that's sufficiently competitive for the buyers, and that's adequate to cover costs. Quite a challenge. Similarly, the local food hub in Charlottesville, which emerged just last year, has done an interesting job and basically connects not to individuals but to what we might call somewhat higher-end accounts. This would be restaurants in and around the Charlottesville area, but also the University of Virginia medical system, Charlottesville, and some county school systems. And their system, again, very similar to some of the other value chains, with a distribution center, with a trucking capacity, and with a group of about 36 farmers, but oriented more towards specialty buyers, specialty crops, mixed in with more traditional crops, and able at this point to secure a pretty good price for their growers, but having to go into a large number of buyers, and particularly a large number of products, more so than buyers, to be able to maintain that good price. The challenge of inadequate infrastructure has to do with, again, respondents talked about either not owning or managing it, that's a big challenge. And those who do own it or manage it, talked about the difficulty in the complexity of it. It's just very difficult to manage infrastructure, whether it's a value-adding kitchen, whether it's a produce aggregation center, or many of other types. It's just a complex, expensive undertaking that's hard to meet ends with. Appalachian Harvest in Southwest Virginia, which is operated by Appalachian Sustainable Development, has had one of the region's more substantial infrastructure for quite some time. These are a couple of pictures from the packing and grading facility they have, which is in the central part of the Southwest Virginia, Northeast Tennessee region, a 15,000 square foot facility with several grading lines, with walk-in coolers that manages fairly high volumes of produce now, and is built and designed to manage much higher volumes still. Also includes delivery trucks. You'll see the little miniature fleet of delivery trucks there, including a tractor trailer, and then sells to primarily supermarkets. Whole Foods is one example. There's actually 7 or 8 supermarket customers, most of them regionally based. Whole Foods would be one of the few national chains. But linking all of that together has been what the Appalachian Harvest enterprise has gotten quite good at, and the issue for them, again, is building sufficient supply to meet these buyers. Another interesting example is run by the Appalachian Community Economic Networks in Southeast Ohio, what they call their Food We Love program, and this is with value-added foods. You can see some little examples there. They build display cases. People have to apply. They have to have a certain quality standard and other standards that are met to make it a value chain type endeavor. And then for those businesses that do get it, which are, again, high-end value-added foods, they are able to secure places in specific markets, from small local retail outlets to at least one larger supermarket, and have a kind of a unifying brand, even though each individual product also has its own brand, but tying it together with a very creative branding called Food We Love. Not surprisingly, the tools and practices that people cited, we've pretty well discussed these. Securing large and well-paying, reliable markets is the key from most people's point of view. And then right on its heels, the infrastructure question we've been talking about. Policy, I do want to mention one other example here of effective policy tools. This is a picture from work done by the Jubilee Project and its CAFE, which is the Clinch Appalachian Farming Enterprise. This is Lisa Long, formerly with CAFE, delivering potato wedges to the buyer, I believe, in the Hawkins County, Tennessee school system. That was in part made possible by all the work they'd done with growers, with building an infrastructure, but also because Jubilee worked with other groups and actually got a piece of legislation passed in the Tennessee legislature a couple of years ago, which, as you can see there, essentially removed the barriers to buying locally for schools, public schools, and in fact even required public schools to develop a plan for how they were going to source locally. It doesn't commit them to any particular percentage, but it does require them to at least start looking into this, which was a pretty major step forward. So that's a case where policy and on-the-ground work went hand in hand. The most common additional elements, again, we've talked about it previously, is building consumer understanding of what's really involved and why it may be worth a little bit more, and then farmer networks. In terms of the consumer understanding, many of the groups do many different things, from farm tours for consumers to build that understanding, to local meals where people get to taste the bounty of local meats, produce, eggs, dairy, etc. A lot of creative things going on. That is, I think, yielding results in terms of consumer awareness and understanding. In terms of farmer networks, several of the groups employ farmer networks, and I think that all of them that do feel that these are really quite critical. The farmer networks might be more around marketing, as in the case of the Food We Love. It's a branding type of approach. It might be actually production networks, as in the case of Appalachian Harvest. And in this case, with Rich Pirog and the Leopold Center, many people have heard of their approach that they call communities of practice. And basically, they bring together groups within a certain sector. In this case, you're looking at their niche pork group, and provide a space for growers to come together. And you'll see here what they have found over the last several years are the key elements that these communities of practice provide. So you bring the producers together and you create essentially a really efficient, what Rich Pirog called a multi-organizational extension that better meets farmers' needs. That hub, that space, is a great information sharing catalyst. It seems to begin, if the producers stick with it for any period of time, to cultivate the trust that is needed to operate cooperatively. It's a magnet for funding, both investment and philanthropic, and it seems to be a great place where good ideas, new ideas, cutting-edge thinking are shared. And it ultimately, Rich coined the term co-opetition, that it fosters this idea that people cooperating together can be more competitive. And whether that's in co-branding, whether that's in information sharing, Rich, in a discussion with him a few days ago, he mentioned that although it's not a necessary outcome of the communities of practice, many people, in fact, end up involved in some level of joint venture within these communities of practice, and that's quite exciting. A couple of tools real quick, and then we'll just respond to any questions in the remaining time. I did want to mention this wonderful paper that Rich and Steve Stevenson and perhaps some others were involved in. Some of you know Steve and Rich in the Agriculture of the Middle. And it's a paper called Values-Based Food Supply Chains. And it's really targeted on how do we do that for those farmers in the middle or enterprises in the middle, which would be kind of the mid-size family farms. Can we make this work beyond the very small kind of micro-farming, niche farming? And an excellent paper to consider and look at as you get into this work. And another tool just recently to toot our own horn that was created by Appalachian Sustainable Development, I was the primary author, is just now finally available. It's a toolkit for building value chains, a healthy food systems value chain toolkit. You see a couple of little excerpts from it there, available from Appalachian Sustainable Development. To give you a few contact information, I'll leave these up here for the next little bit as we look at questions. Again, there's the contact for the Toolkit, for Central Appalachian Network, Good Food Network. Wayne Fawbush at the Ford Foundation is very, very involved in this work in the Appalachian region particularly, and for my own business. So I think for the balance of the time, we will look at questions. So a first question here. There was a clarifying question which I hope I've answered by now. What do you mean by infrastructure? The infrastructure, again, generally speaking, means some sort of physical plant that allows people to either aggregate a product, that is to say to pool it, to bring it from many producers to one place and efficiently package it and get it ready for shipping to market. Or infrastructure might involve actually transforming the product in the case of a slaughterhouse, or in the case of a shared use kitchen where you are transforming that product into something else. And of course, always distribution is an element of the infrastructure. Refrigerated trucks, freezer trucks, other sorts of systems to get them in line. The question, I have a question here about whether or not I'm using value chains in the sense that Michael Porter originated the term, and I have to confess that I don't know how he originated that term. The follow-up question is that that all the activities in the firm are all the firms are engaged in all the activities while they're doing business. So I have to confess I'm not quite clear on what that question is. But in the value chain, let me just say that if I'm understanding the question correctly, there can be participants in the chain that do multiple elements of business within the value chain. They may participate themselves in several levels of the value chain, or they may have a very discrete and very specific set of activities in the value chain. Also, let me be clear in saying that many of the farmers who participate in value chains, that is by no means all of their production, all of their marketing, and all of their output. In fact, it's probably more typical that while a sizable part of their production might be dedicated to a value chain, many of these farmers have other outlets, other market relationships they've developed, other ways of moving their product, whatever it is. A question about a little more explanation of leverage. I did use that term earlier. A couple of folks spoke to this very strongly. One of them, some folks know Diana Endicott, who's done such an extraordinary job at the Good-Natured Family Farms. The notion is that basically small farmers and small-scale food system work is at a pretty profound disadvantage. That's a disadvantage of scale. It's a disadvantage of historically not having a lot of resources from the support agencies and the academic institutions. Of course, that's changing for the better, but oftentimes there's been inadequate support. And for a variety of reasons, that's led us to be kind of at a chronic disadvantage. The leverage that Diana talked about was not putting all of your eggs in one buyer's basket, not putting all of your eggs in one part of the value chain or one segment of the marketplace, having multiple products and having multiple buyers. Now, we know from experience down here that you can have too many products and too many buyers, so it's finding the right balance. But you leave yourself vulnerable if you develop a relationship with a single institutional buyer, a single retail outlet, a single university. And the idea of leverage is you want your product to be attractive to a lot of different entities, to a lot of different buyers. And by making it attractive, you want to get to the point where people want what you have, and once you get to that point, you have leverage, particularly among buyers. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point, so I will turn it back to Jeff. If any more questions arise in the last few minutes, I'll be happy to jump back in. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff to kind of wrap things up and talk about the next webinar coming up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anthony. There was one other question about the availability and cost for the ASD toolkit. Is that known yet?
The cost will be $15 for the toolkit. We have had some virus problems with the website, so the simplest, that is to say the ASD website, that are being resolved, but the simplest and safest way to do it at this point is to use that information, either a phone call or an email to asd@asdevelop.org, and you can order your value chain toolkit there.
All right, great. Thanks very much. Okay, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the National Good Food Network in case some of you are not familiar with it. The National Good Food Network, or NGFN, is committed to scaling up good food, and good food is defined as healthy, fair, affordable, and green. We work at all levels of the value chain, starting with producers, with special emphasis placed on supporting small and mid-sized producers. The NGFN is committed to market-based solutions to changing the food system to scale up the quantity of good food. So, as such, we aim to connect the growers with accountable buyers, assuring that the food gets distributed widely to consumers. A note on the structure. The NGFN is made up of 10 regional lead teams throughout the U.S. Each lead team is well connected to the good food efforts in their region, and they serve to coordinate the activities within their respective regions. They are, in a sense, the hubs in their region. The leaders of each RLT, in addition to some other national experts, including Anthony, serve as the advisory council of the National Good Food Network. In concert with the Wallace Center at Winrock International, the advisory council connects the regions to each other, connects the network to funding opportunities, and connects the network members to the best of the best knowledge and case studies on scaling up good food. And this is an excellent example of that, this webinar. Our next webinar, we do have a National Good Food Network webinar series. They're always the third Thursday each month, starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This second Thursday was sort of a bonus webinar. So mark your calendars. You can make a repeating event. The subject for our next webinar, 1 week from today, is all about third-party certification. Scott Exo, the Executive Director of the Food Alliance and the National Good Food Network Advisory Council member, will take you through from the basics of certification to some of the very nitty-gritty. And we'll also have two very interesting case studies, one a processor and the other a retailer who decided to get certified. They will share their experiences, both good and bad, with you. As with all NGFN webinars, including this one, you will have a chance to ask these practitioners the questions most relevant to you. You can register for the certification webinar at ngfn.org/webinars. We also have a growing archive of all the NGFN webinars, recordings, slides, written question and answers, and other resources. For this webinar, we can link to the ASD toolkit as well. If you'd like to get more information about the NGFN, visit our website. You can add your name to our growing database of people, organization, and funders, increasing our ability to connect people within and across regions. Please contact us at any time. Our email address is contact@ngfn.org. The NGFN and the Central Appalachian Network, thank you for your time today. Once again, let me encourage you to fill out the survey that will open in your web browser in just a moment. This concludes the webinar. Have a great day.